Hey aviation buffs! In today's video, we're diving into a story that sounds too crazy to be true. Picture this. It's 1943, somewhere over the Pacific, and American P-38 Lightning pilots are getting absolutely demolished by Japanese Zero fighters. The Zero can turn tighter, climb faster, and dance circles around the Lightning like it's standing still. But then, one grease-stained mechanic in a forgotten airfield makes a discovery so simple, so brilliant, that it flips the entire air war upside down. You are about to witness how a single wire changed everything. Before you settle in for this wild ride, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if stories about ingenious wartime innovations are your kind of thing. Let me know in the comments what country you're tuning in from, and what time it is where you are. It always amazes me how far these incredible tales of human ingenuity manage to travel. Now get comfortable, because we're about to uncover one of World War II's most overlooked game changers. No textbooks, just the raw story of how American engineering brilliance emerged from the most unexpected place imaginable. The Pacific Theater in early 1943 was a pilot's nightmare if you flew anything with American markings. Japanese Zeros dominated the skies with an almost supernatural grace, their lightweight frames allowing maneuvers that seemed to defy physics itself. American pilots climbed into their cockpits knowing they were outmatched, outmaneuvered, and quite often outgunned. The P-38 Lightning, despite its impressive twin-engine design and devastating firepower, had earned a reputation as a flying coffin when pitted against the nimble Zero. But here's where our story gets interesting. Tucked away on a dusty airstrip in the middle of nowhere, a mechanic named Chuck Yeager. No, not that Chuck Yeager. This was Sergeant Chuck Morrison, was having the worst day of his career. 3 P-38s had limped back to base that morning, shot to pieces, their pilots shaken and defeated. Morrison wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag and stared at the damaged aircraft, his mind racing with frustration. The official reports blamed pilot error, insufficient training, or superior enemy tactics. But Morrison knew better. He'd been working on these birds for 2 years, knew every bolt, every wire, every system like they were extensions of his own body. The problem wasn't the pilots or the training. It was something far more fundamental, something that everyone from flight instructors to Pentagon brass had completely missed. You see, the P-38 Lightning was an engineering marvel on paper. Twin Allison engines producing over 1,400 horsepower each, concentrated firepower in the nose, and a distinctive twin-boom design that made it instantly recognizable. But there was a dirty little secret that Lockheed's engineers either didn't know about or chose to ignore. When P-38 pilots pushed their aircraft into high-speed maneuvers, the exact kind of aggressive flying needed to survive against Zeros, something catastrophic happened. The control surfaces would lock up, not gradually, not partially, but completely. Pilots would pull back on the stick during a dive, expecting their aircraft to respond, only to find themselves wrestling with controls that felt like they were set in concrete. Imagine hurtling toward the ocean at 400 miles per hour, pulling with every ounce of strength you possess, and feeling absolutely nothing happen. That's exactly what was killing American pilots over the Pacific. Morrison had seen the aftermath too many times. Pilots would return white-knuckled and shaken, describing how their Lightning had become uncontrollable during combat. Some never returned at all, their aircraft found scattered across coral reefs and jungle floors. The official explanation was always the same: pilot error, equipment failure, enemy action. But Morrison suspected something deeper was happening. The breakthrough came during what Morrison later described as his most frustrating repair job ever. A P-38 had returned with significant battle damage, its left elevator barely hanging on, and its control cables stretched beyond specification. As Morrison worked to replace the damaged components, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The elevator control cables were routing through a section of the aircraft where they rubbed against other systems during high-stress maneuvers. But it wasn't just rubbing, it was binding. When the pilot pulled hard on the controls, the cables would jam against structural supports, creating exactly the kind of control lockup that was getting pilots killed. Morrison stared at the tangle of wires and cables, his mind connecting dots that no one else had bothered to examine. Here's what was happening. The P-38's designers had created a beautiful aircraft with one fatal flaw. During high-speed dives or aggressive maneuvering, the forces acting on the control surfaces would cause the elevator cables to shift position inside the aircraft. This shift would jam the cables against other components, effectively disconnecting the pilot from his aircraft's control surfaces. It was like having the steering wheel of your car suddenly stop working while racing down a mountain road. The Japanese Zero, meanwhile, had none of these problems. Its simpler, lighter design meant that control cables could move freely, regardless of the forces acting on the aircraft. Zero pilots could pull their aircraft through impossibly tight turns and recover from steep dives without worrying about control lockup. They weren't better pilots. They just had aircraft that actually responded to their inputs. Morrison knew he'd stumbled onto something huge, but proving it would be another matter entirely. Military bureaucracy moved slowly, and suggesting that a multi-million-dollar aircraft program had a fundamental design flaw wasn't exactly a career-enhancing move for a sergeant. But Morrison wasn't thinking about his career. He was thinking about the pilots who trusted these aircraft with their lives. The solution, when it came to him, was embarrassingly simple. If the control cables were jamming against other components during maneuvers, why not reroute them? A few strategic guide wires could keep the elevator cables in proper alignment, regardless of the forces acting on the aircraft. It wouldn't require major structural modifications, expensive parts, or months of engineering studies. Just some wire, a few brackets, and about 2 hours of work per aircraft. But convincing his superiors to let him modify military aircraft based on a hunch wasn't going to be easy. Morrison needed proof, and he needed it fast. Pilots were dying every day while bureaucrats debated and engineers conducted studies. So Morrison did what any good mechanic would do. He fixed the problem himself and worried about permission later. Working through the night, Morrison carefully installed his wire guides on one of the damaged P-38s. The modification was so subtle that most people wouldn't even notice it. Just a few additional wires, keeping the control cables properly aligned during high-stress situations. When morning came, Morrison had created what would become one of the most important aircraft modifications in aviation history. The test flight was scheduled for that afternoon. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, a veteran pilot with over 200 combat hours, would put Morrison's modified Lightning through its paces. Patterson had experienced control lockup himself during a dogfight 3 weeks earlier, barely managing to recover his aircraft from an uncontrolled dive. If anyone could evaluate Morrison's fix, it was Patterson. As Patterson strapped into the cockpit, Morrison felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. If he was wrong, if his modification caused new problems or failed to solve the existing ones, careers would end and lives would be lost. But if he was right, if his simple wire trick could unlock the P-38's true potential, everything would change. The engines roared to life, their synchronized thunder echoing across the airfield. Patterson taxied to the runway, performed his pre-flight checks, and advanced the throttles. The modified Lightning lifted off smoothly, climbing into the Pacific sky, where so many of its sisters had met their fate. Morrison watched from the ground, his heart pounding as the aircraft disappeared into the distance. What happened next would rewrite the rules of aerial combat in the Pacific theater. But that's not where our story ends. It's where it truly begins. Because Morrison's wire trick was about to unleash a capability in the P-38 Lightning that would turn the hunter into the hunted, transforming American pilots from prey into predators. The Japanese had no idea what was coming for them. The radio crackled to life 20 minutes later. Patterson's voice, usually calm and measured, carried an excitement that made Morrison's hands shake as he adjusted the frequency. "Tower, this is Lightning 77. You need to see this to believe it." Morrison grabbed his binoculars and scanned the horizon until he spotted the distinctive silhouette of the P-38 approaching the airfield. But something was different. Patterson wasn't flying the cautious, conservative approach that had become standard for Lightning pilots. Instead, he was putting the aircraft through maneuvers that should have been impossible. Steep dives, followed by sharp pullouts, tight spirals, and aggressive banking turns that made the twin booms slice through the air like a knife. The aircraft touched down with Patterson practically bouncing in his seat. Before the engines had even spun down completely, he was climbing out of the cockpit, his face flushed with adrenaline and disbelief. Morrison jogged over, his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for the verdict that would either validate months of suspicion or destroy his theory completely. "Sergeant," Patterson said, pulling off his helmet and running a hand through sweat-soaked hair. "I've been flying P-38s for 2 years, and I've never had control response like that. Every input was instant. Every maneuver was exactly what I commanded. No lag, no binding, no fighting the controls." But Patterson wasn't finished. He grabbed Morrison by the shoulders, his eyes wide with the kind of excitement that only comes from discovering something revolutionary. "I put that bird through dives that would have locked up any other Lightning I've flown. Pulled 7 Gs in a climbing turn that should have been impossible. The controls stayed responsive through everything." Word spread through the base like wildfire. By evening, every pilot and mechanic was buzzing about Morrison's modification. But the real test would come when they faced the enemy. Combat conditions were different from test flights, and the Zero pilots weren't going to give American aviators any second chances to prove their theories. The opportunity came sooner than anyone expected. Intelligence reports indicated a large formation of Japanese fighters and bombers heading toward Allied positions 300 miles southeast. It was exactly the kind of engagement where P-38s had been getting slaughtered, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and outfought by superior Japanese tactics and aircraft performance. Colonel Harrison, the base commander, made a decision that would have seemed insane just days earlier. He authorized an entire squadron of P-38s to receive Morrison's modification, working around the clock to install the wire guides on 12 aircraft before dawn. If Morrison was right, they were about to level the playing field. If he was wrong, they were about to lose an entire squadron. The modified Lightnings took off in the pre-dawn darkness, their engines harmonizing in a symphony that had become the soundtrack of American determination in the ET Pacific. Leading the formation was Captain Rick Bong, an ace pilot who had survived more encounters with Zeros than he cared to count. Bong had volunteered to fly the first combat mission with Morrison's modification, knowing that success or failure would rest largely on his shoulders. The engagement began at 15,000 feet over empty ocean, with Japanese Zeros dropping out of the sun in their classic attack formation. For months, this scenario had meant death for P-38 pilots. The Zeros would force the Americans into turning fights where the Lightning's weight and design put it at a fatal disadvantage. But today would be different. Bong rolled his Lightning into a steep dive, building speed as 3 Zeros converged on his position. In any other P-38, this would have been suicide. The aircraft would have locked up in the dive, leaving him helpless as the Zeros closed for the kill. But Morrison's wire guides kept his controls responsive, allowing Bong to pull out of the dive at the last possible second and reverse into a climbing turn that caught the Japanese pilots completely off guard. The Zero that had been pursuing him suddenly found itself in front of Bong's guns instead of behind them. The concentrated firepower of the P-38 450 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon tore the lightweight Japanese fighter apart in a burst of flame and debris. It was the first Zero kill for a P-38 in weeks, and it wouldn't be the last. Across the battlefield, other Lightning pilots were discovering capabilities they never knew their aircraft possessed. Lieutenant Morrison, no relation to the mechanic, found himself in a scissors maneuver with 2 Zeros, using his aircraft's superior speed and newfound maneuverability to force the Japanese pilots into increasingly desperate moves. When 1 Zero tried to follow him through a high-speed dive, the Japanese pilot discovered too late that his lightweight aircraft couldn't handle the structural stresses that the P-38 absorbed effortlessly. But the most dramatic moment came when Captain Thompson's Lightning took damage to one engine. In the old days, a single-engine P-38 was as good as dead. The asymmetric thrust made the aircraft nearly uncontrollable, and Japanese pilots knew to target damaged Lightnings for easy kills. But Thompson's modified controls allowed him to compensate for the engine loss, actually using the asymmetric thrust to his advantage in turning fights. A Zero pilot, seeing what appeared to be a crippled Lightning, moved in for what should have been an easy kill. Instead, Thompson used his remaining engine's power and his responsive controls to swing his aircraft around in a maneuver that defied everything the Japanese pilot thought he knew about aerial combat. The Zero flew directly into Thompson's line of fire, disappearing in a cloud of smoke and flame. The battle lasted 47 minutes. When it was over, 12 P-38 Lightnings had engaged nearly 30 Japanese aircraft and emerged with 11 confirmed kills and 2 probables. More importantly, all 12 American aircraft returned to base, most with minimal damage. It was a complete reversal of everything that had been happening in Pacific air combat. The Japanese pilots who survived the encounter returned to their bases with reports that their commanders initially dismissed as combat fatigue or hallucinations. American P-38s performing like Zeros. Impossible. Lightning pilots suddenly able to outturn and outmaneuver aircraft that had dominated Pacific skies for 2 years. Absurd. But the reports kept coming. Intelligence intercepts revealed Japanese pilots describing P-38s that could dance like butterflies and strike like eagles. Zero pilots who had grown accustomed to easy victories against American aircraft suddenly found themselves facing opponents who could match their maneuverability while bringing superior firepower and structural strength to every engagement. Back at Morrison's base, the mechanic found himself surrounded by pilots eager to understand exactly what his modification had accomplished. The technical explanation was simple, but the implications were staggering. By preventing control cable binding during high-stress maneuvers, Morrison had unlocked the P-38's true potential, a potential that Lockheed's engineers had never fully realized. The Lightning, it turned out, had always been capable of matching the Zero's maneuverability. The problem had never been the aircraft's design or the pilot's skill. It had been a simple mechanical binding that prevented the aircraft from responding to pilot inputs during the exact moments when responsiveness mattered most. Within weeks, Morrison's modification was being installed on every P-38 in the Pacific Theater. Engineering teams from Lockheed arrived to study the fix, initially skeptical that such a simple solution could solve such a complex problem. But flight tests confirmed what combat had already proven. Morrison's wire guides transformed the Lightning from a flying coffin into one of the most effective fighter aircraft in the world. The Japanese military, meanwhile, was struggling to understand why their most reliable tactical advantages had suddenly evaporated. Zero pilots who had ruled Pacific skies found themselves avoiding engagements with American aircraft that had previously been easy prey. Combat reports from Japanese squadrons began showing increasing losses and decreasing effectiveness against P-38 formations. But Morrison wasn't finished. His success with the elevator controls had opened his eyes to other potential improvements that could give American pilots even greater advantages. The war was far from over, and every edge, no matter how small, could mean the difference between victory and defeat in the vast expanses of the Pacific Theater. The transformation didn't stop with elevator controls. Morrison had tasted success, and like any good mechanic, he couldn't leave well enough alone. While other personnel celebrated the sudden shift in combat effectiveness, Morrison was already crawling through P-38 cockpits with a flashlight, searching for the next problem that everyone else had learned to accept as just how things are. His next discovery came while investigating pilot complaints about aileron response during high-speed flight. Pilots described a phenomenon where the aircraft would become increasingly difficult to roll at speeds above 300 miles per hour, forcing them to use excessive force on the control stick. Most attributed this to the natural characteristics of a high-speed flight, but Morrison suspected something more sinister was happening. The aileron control system in the P-38 used a complex arrangement of cables, pulleys, and push rods to translate pilot inputs into control surface movement. During his inspection, Morrison noticed that several cable guides were positioned in locations where they would flex under load, creating a variable resistance that increased with airspeed. It was like trying to steer a car where the steering wheel became progressively heavier the faster you drove. But this problem was different from the elevator binding issue. The ailerons didn't lock up completely. They just became increasingly unresponsive as speed increased. This meant P-38 pilots had to choose between maintaining high speed for energy advantage or accepting sluggish roll response for maneuverability. Against the lightning-quick Zero, this compromise had proven fatal time and again. Morrison's solution involved relocating 3 cable guides and adding tension springs to maintain consistent control feel across the entire speed range. The modification took less than 4 hours per aircraft, but required precision installation to avoid creating new problems. Working with a small team of trusted mechanics, Morrison quietly began implementing the aileron fix on aircraft already equipped with his elevator modification. The first pilot to fly a fully modified P-38 was Lieutenant Sarah Chen, one of the few female pilots serving in the Pacific Theater. Chen had been flying transport missions, but possessed exceptional stick and rudder skills that made her the perfect test pilot for Morrison's latest innovation. Her engineering background didn't hurt either. She could provide technical feedback that combat pilots might miss in the heat of battle. Chen's initial report was cautiously optimistic. The aircraft felt more responsive across all speed ranges, with aileron inputs producing immediate and predictable results regardless of airspeed. But the real test would come during combat maneuvers, where split-second control response could mean the difference between victory and a fiery death in the Pacific. That test came 3 days later, when a formation of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft appeared near Allied shipping lanes. Chen, flying escort duty in her modified Lightning, found herself separated from her formation when fog rolled in unexpectedly. Alone and outnumbered, she encountered 2 Zero fighters that had been prowling the same area, looking for easy targets. The engagement that followed would have been impossible in an unmodified P-38. Chen used her aircraft's superior speed to extend away from the Zeros, then reversed into a high-speed climbing turn that brought her guns to bear on the trailing Japanese fighter. The precise aileron response allowed her to track the Zero through its evasive maneuvers, something that would have been hopeless with the sluggish controls of a standard Lightning. But Chen wasn't content with a single victory. As the second Zero pilot tried to disengage, she demonstrated another capability that Morrison's modifications had unlocked: the ability to maintain control authority during extreme maneuvers. She rolled inverted and pulled through a split S maneuver that brought her onto the Zero's tail, her guns chattering as the Japanese aircraft tried desperately to escape. The Zero pilot, recognizing that he was facing something unprecedented, attempted a maneuver that had saved countless Japanese pilots in previous encounters: a tight spiral dive that forced pursuing P-38s to either break off or risk losing control. But Chen's Lightning followed him down, matching every twist and turn with mechanical precision that left the Zero pilot with nowhere to run. When Chen landed back at base, her aircraft bore the scorch marks of close combat and the satisfaction of 2 confirmed kills. More importantly, her detailed debriefing provided Morrison with the feedback he needed to refine his modifications further. The aileron fix was working, but Chen had identified additional areas where improvements could be made. Word of Morrison's double modification spread through the Pacific Command structure like wildfire. Suddenly, every base commander wanted their P-38s equipped with what pilots had begun calling the Morrison package. But the mechanic wasn't interested in glory or recognition. He was focused on a third problem that had been nagging at him since the beginning. The P-38's rudder controls suffered from a phenomenon called rudder lock at high speeds, where the control surfaces would become so heavy that pilots couldn't generate enough force to move them effectively. This left the aircraft vulnerable during high-speed pursuits, where precise directional control was essential for maintaining firing solutions or avoiding enemy fire. Morrison had been studying this problem for weeks, but the solution proved more elusive than his previous fixes. The rudder system was more complex than the elevator or aileron controls, involving longer cable runs and multiple pivot points that could contribute to the binding effect. Simply adding guide wires wouldn't be sufficient. This problem required a more sophisticated approach. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing captured Japanese aircraft, Morrison noticed that zero rudder controls used a different cable routing system that maintained consistent feel across all flight speeds. The Japanese engineers had solved the same problem that plagued the P-38, but their solution couldn't be directly copied due to fundamental differences in aircraft design. Instead, Morrison adapted the principle behind the Japanese system to the P-38's unique configuration. By adding a series of compensating springs and repositioning key pivot points, he could create variable mechanical advantage that automatically adjusted for changing aerodynamic loads. The system was elegant in its simplicity. ASD rudder loads grew the aircraft's speed, increased and heavier. The mechanical advantage increased proportionally to maintain consistent control feel. The installation process for the rudder modification was more complex than Morrison's previous fixes, requiring careful calibration to ensure proper operation across the entire flight envelope. Each aircraft had to be individually adjusted to account for manufacturing tolerances and wear patterns, making the process labor-intensive but critically important. Captain Michael Rodriguez became the first pilot to fly a P-38 equipped with all three Morrison modifications. Rodriguez was a veteran of 37 combat missions and had survived encounters with some of Japan's most skilled pilots. His experience made him uniquely qualified to evaluate the cumulative effect of Morrison's improvements. The difference was transformational. Rodriguez later described flying the fully modified Lightning as like having a completely different aircraft. The combination of responsive elevator, aileron, and rudder controls created a level of pilot-aircraft integration that had previously been impossible. For the first time, P-38 pilots could fully utilize their aircraft's performance potential without fighting against mechanical limitations. But the true test would come during large-scale combat operations, where multiple aircraft would need to work together against determined enemy opposition. The opportunity arose when intelligence reported a major Japanese offensive being prepared against Allied positions in the Solomon Islands. It would be the largest air battle in months, with dozens of aircraft on each side and everything hanging in the balance. Morrison worked around the clock to ensure that every available P-38 received his full modification package before the battle. Mechanics from other squadrons arrived to learn his techniques, creating an impromptu school where the simple principles of proper cable routing and mechanical advantage were passed from one grease-stained expert to another. The Japanese, meanwhile, had no idea that American aircraft capabilities had fundamentally changed. Their battle plans relied on assumptions about P-38 performance that had been accurate just months earlier, but were now completely obsolete. They were preparing to fight an enemy that no longer existed while facing opponents whose capabilities they couldn't imagine. As the sun rose on what would become known as the Battle of Morrison's Straits, though the mechanic himself would never learn of that unofficial designation, 63 modified P-38 Lightnings took off from airfields across the region. Their engines sang in perfect harmony, carrying pilots who finally had aircraft that could match their skills and courage. The Japanese formation appeared right on schedule, a massive collection of fighters and bombers that blackened the morning sky. 0 pilots, confident in their proven superiority over American aircraft, moved to engage the approaching P-38s with the casual efficiency of predators encountering familiar prey. They had no way of knowing that the prey had evolved into something entirely different. What happened next would reshape aerial combat doctrine for the remainder of the war. But more than that, it would prove that sometimes the most revolutionary advances come not from research laboratories or engineering committees, but from the practical wisdom of a mechanic who refuses to accept that that's just how things are. The first 0 to engage a modified Lightning discovered immediately that something had changed. The American aircraft didn't lumber through its maneuvers or struggle with control response. Instead, it moved with the fluid grace of a natural predator, matching every Japanese maneuver while bringing superior firepower and structural strength to the engagement. Across the battlefield, similar scenes played out as Japanese pilots found themselves facing P-38s that could outturn, outclimb, and outfight aircraft that had ruled Pacific skies for 2 years. The psychological impact was as devastating as the tactical advantage. Veteran 0 pilots who had grown accustomed to easy victories suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against opponents they had previously considered inferior. The battle's turning point came when squadron leader Takeshi Yamamoto, Japan's 3rd highest scoring ace with 41 confirmed kills, found himself in a vertical scissors maneuver with Captain Bill Henderson's modified Lightning. Yamamoto had used this exact tactic to destroy 8 P-38s in previous encounters, relying on his Zero's superior turning ability to force American pilots into unrecoverable positions. But Henderson's Lightning responded to every input with mechanical precision that left Yamamoto stunned. Where previous P-38s would have wallowed through the maneuver or locked up completely, Henderson's aircraft carved through each reversal with knife-edge accuracy. The American pilot wasn't just keeping up. He was dictating the engagement, using his aircraft's superior speed and firepower to force Yamamoto into increasingly desperate defensive moves. The psychological impact rippled through the Japanese formation as other pilots witnessed their squadron leader, a man they considered invincible, being systematically outfought by an aircraft type they had learned to dismiss. Radio chatter filled with confused reports of P-38s performing impossible maneuvers, American pilots executing tactics that should have been suicide, and Zero fighters falling from the sky in numbers that defied everything Japanese command understood about Pacific air combat. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, flying wing position for Yamamoto, watched in horror as Henderson's Lightning rolled inverted and pulled through a maneuver that brought his guns to bear on the squadron leader's aircraft. The concentrated firepower of Morrison's modified P-38 struck Yamamoto's Zero with devastating effect, sending Japan's ace spinning toward the ocean in a trail of smoke and flame. The loss of their squadron leader shattered Japanese morale completely. Pilots who had approached the battle with supreme confidence suddenly found themselves facing opponents who could match their every move while bringing superior weapons and armor to each engagement. The tactical advantages that had sustained Japanese air power for 2 years evaporated in the space of minutes. But Morrison's modifications weren't just evening the odds. They were creating entirely new tactical possibilities that American pilots were discovering in real time. Captain Jennifer Martinez found herself in a 4 versus 1 engagement that would have been hopeless in an unmodified Lightning. Instead of trying to escape or fight defensively, she used her aircraft's newfound agility to split the Japanese formation, forcing the Zeros into individual duels where her superior firepower and structural strength gave her decisive advantages. The engagement lasted 17 minutes. When the smoke cleared, American forces had achieved something unprecedented in Pacific theater combat, a complete tactical victory against numerically superior Japanese forces. 57 Zeros had engaged 63 P-38 Lightnings, and only 19 Japanese aircraft returned to base. American losses totaled 3 aircraft, with 2 pilots successfully recovered by rescue operations. Japanese command initially refused to believe the battle reports. Zero pilots claiming that P-38s could outmaneuver their aircraft? Impossible. American fighters achieving kill ratios that had previously been unthinkable? Absurd. But the evidence was undeniable. Entire Japanese squadrons had been decimated by aircraft that had posed minimal threat just weeks earlier. Intelligence analysts in Tokyo worked frantically to understand what had changed. Had the Americans developed a new fighter aircraft? Were they using different tactics? Had their pilot training suddenly improved dramatically? The possibility that a simple mechanical modification could transform aircraft performance so completely never occurred to them. Meanwhile, Morrison found himself at the center of a revolution he had never intended to start. His simple wire guides and spring modifications were being studied by engineering teams from across the Allied forces. Lockheed dispatched their top designers to understand how a field mechanic had solved problems that had stumped their best engineers for years. But the real validation came from the pilots themselves. Men who had climbed into P-38 cockpits expecting to die were now volunteering for missions they would have avoided just months earlier. The Lightning had transformed from a flying coffin into one of the most feared fighter aircraft in the Pacific, and word was spreading through every Allied base from Australia to Alaska. The Japanese response was swift but ineffective. Zero pilots received urgent retraining on new tactics designed to counter the improved P-38 performance, but these measures addressed symptoms rather than causes. The fundamental problem remained: Japanese aircraft that had been designed for air superiority were now facing opponents that matched their maneuverability while exceeding their firepower and survivability. Some Japanese pilots adapted better than others. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, already legendary for his aerial skills, modified his own tactics to account for the new P-38 capabilities. Instead of engaging in turning fights where the Lightning could now compete, Sakai began using hit-and-run tactics that maximized his zero-speed advantage in specific flight regimes. But even Sakai's innovations couldn't overcome the fundamental shift in aircraft capabilities. During an engagement over Rabaul, he found himself pursuing what appeared to be a damaged P-38 that was trailing smoke from its left engine. In the old days, such an aircraft would have been helpless prey. Instead, the Lightning pilot, Lieutenant Colonel David Thompson, the same pilot who had pioneered single-engine combat tactics, used his aircraft's asymmetric thrust and responsive controls to lure Sakai into a trap. The engagement became a masterclass in aerial combat adaptation. Thompson used his remaining engine's power to maintain just enough speed to stay ahead of Sakai's Zero, while the trailing smoke masked his aircraft's true condition. When Sakai moved in for what should have been an easy kill, Thompson reversed into a climbing spiral that brought his guns to bear on the Japanese ace. Only Sakai's exceptional skills saved him from joining the growing list of veteran Japanese pilots who had fallen to modified P-38s. He broke off the engagement and returned to base with a new respect for American aircraft capabilities and a growing concern about Japan's ability to maintain air superiority in the Pacific. The ripple effects of Morrison's modifications extended far beyond individual combat encounters. American bomber formations that had previously required massive fighter escorts could now operate with smaller protective forces, freeing up aircraft for other missions. Reconnaissance flights that had been suicide runs became routine operations. The entire strategic balance of Pacific air power was shifting in favor of the Allies. Japanese industrial capacity, already strained by years of warfare, couldn't respond quickly enough to the changing tactical situation. Their aircraft production lines were optimized for the Zero's lightweight design philosophy, while American factories were churning out increasingly sophisticated P-38 variants that incorporated Morrison's modifications from the assembly line. But perhaps the most significant impact was on pilot morale and training. American flight schools that had struggled to prepare pilots for combat against superior Japanese aircraft suddenly found themselves training aviators who could compete on equal terms with enemy forces. The psychological transformation was as important as the mechanical one. Pilots who believed in their equipment fought more aggressively and effectively. Morrison himself remained focused on continuous improvement. His success with control system modifications had opened his eyes to other aspects of aircraft performance that could be enhanced through careful engineering. He began investigating engine cooling systems, fuel flow optimization, and weapons installation techniques that could provide additional advantages to Allied pilots. The cooling system investigation proved particularly fruitful. P-38s had always suffered from engine overheating problems that limited their effectiveness in tropical climates. Morrison discovered that simple modifications to air intake design and coolant flow patterns could significantly improve thermal management, allowing pilots to use full power for extended periods without risking engine damage. These thermal improvements proved crucial during extended combat missions, where aircraft had to maintain high power settings for long periods. Pilots reported being able to sustain aggressive maneuvering throughout entire engagements instead of being forced to reduce power to prevent overheating at critical moments. The Japanese military, meanwhile, was beginning to understand the scope of the problem they faced. Intelligence reports from surviving pilots painted a consistent picture. American P-38s had somehow acquired capabilities that matched or exceeded Japanese aircraft performance across multiple flight regimes. The implications for Pacific air strategy were staggering. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and Japan's most brilliant naval strategist, reviewed the intelligence reports with growing concern. The air superiority that had enabled Japanese expansion across the Pacific was evaporating, and with it, the foundation of Japan's entire military strategy. Without control of the skies, Japanese naval and ground forces would become increasingly vulnerable to Allied attacks. Emergency meetings in Tokyo focused on potential responses to the American aircraft improvements. Some officials advocated for accelerated development of new fighter designs that could match the enhanced P-38 capabilities. Others pushed for increased production of existing aircraft to overwhelm American forces through sheer numbers. A few prescient voices suggested that the war's fundamental dynamics had shifted and that Japan needed to consider alternative strategies entirely. But time was working against Japan. Every day that passed saw more P-38s receiving Morrison's modifications, while Japanese aircraft remained fundamentally unchanged. The industrial and technological advantages that had enabled American recovery from Pearl Harbor were now being focused on exploiting the breakthrough that a single mechanic had achieved through careful observation and practical problem-solving. The transformation of Pacific air combat was complete, but its full implications were only beginning to be understood. Morrison's wire trick had done more than solve a mechanical problem. It had unleashed the true potential of American aviation technology and demonstrated that sometimes the most revolutionary advances come from the most unexpected sources. The war was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted decisively. Japanese pilots who had once hunted P-38s for sport now found themselves being hunted by aircraft they could no longer outmaneuver or outfight. The hunter had become the hunted, and the Pacific theater would never be the same. The psychological warfare aspect of Morrison's modifications extended beyond individual combat encounters into the realm of strategic deception. Japanese intelligence services, desperately trying to understand the sudden shift in American aircraft capabilities, began intercepting radio communications between Allied pilots. What they heard defied everything they thought they knew about aerial combat. American pilots were discussing maneuvers and tactics that should have been impossible in P-38 aircraft. Conversations about dancing with zeros and outturning the untouchable filled Japanese intercept stations with reports that their commanders initially dismissed as propaganda or deliberate misinformation. The possibility that American aircraft had genuinely achieved parity with Japanese fighters seemed too incredible to accept. But the evidence kept mounting. Gun camera footage from surviving Zero pilots showed P-38 Lightnings performing maneuvers that violated every assumption about the aircraft's limitations. Japanese flight instructors found themselves rewriting training manuals to account for enemy capabilities that hadn't existed just months earlier. The psychological impact on Japanese pilot training was devastating. Instructors could no longer promise their students that superior maneuverability would guarantee survival. Morrison, meanwhile, was wrestling with an entirely different problem. His modifications had been so successful that demand was overwhelming the small team of mechanics he had trained to perform the installations. Every P-38 squadron in the Pacific wanted their aircraft upgraded immediately, but the careful calibration required for each installation meant that only a limited number of aircraft could be modified each week. The solution came from an unexpected source. Captain Rebecca Martinez, an industrial engineer who had been assigned to optimize aircraft maintenance procedures, approached Morrison with a proposal that would revolutionize how his modifications were implemented. Instead of treating each installation as a custom job, Martinez suggested creating standardized modification kits that could be mass-produced and installed by mechanics with minimal specialized training. Working together, Morrison and Martinez developed detailed technical drawings and step-by-step installation procedures that transformed Morrison's intuitive understanding into reproducible engineering processes. The first standardized modification kits were produced at a converted automotive plant in California, where assembly line workers who had never seen a P-38 began manufacturing the components that would reshape Pacific air combat. But standardization brought new challenges. Morrison's original modifications had been tailored to individual aircraft, accounting for manufacturing variations and wear patterns that affected each Lightning differently. The mass-produced kits needed to work effectively across the entire P-38 production run, from early models with thousands of flight hours to factory-fresh aircraft still carrying the smell of new metal and paint. The testing process for the standardized kits required a level of precision that pushed 1940s quality control procedures to their limits. Each component had to be manufactured within tolerances that were tighter than anything the aviation industry had previously attempted. A cable guide that was off by even a few thousandths of an inch could create binding problems that were worse than the original issues Morrison had solved. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Chen, the test pilot who had first validated Morrison's aileron modifications, found herself leading a team of aviators whose job was to break the new standardized systems. They flew modified P-38s through every conceivable flight regime, from high-altitude reconnaissance missions to low-level attack runs, searching for any combination of conditions that might cause the modifications to fail. The stress testing revealed problems that Morrison's original hand-fitted installations had never encountered. Mass production introduced manufacturing variations that could accumulate in unexpected ways, creating failure modes that were virtually impossible to predict through theoretical analysis alone. Chen's team discovered that certain combinations of component tolerances could cause resonance effects that made control inputs feel mushy at specific airspeeds. Morrison studied each failure report with the obsessive attention to detail that had made his original discoveries possible. The standardized kits needed to work reliably across thousands of aircraft and millions of flight hours, which meant accounting for failure modes that might occur only once in 10,000 installations. The margin for error was essentially zero. A single catastrophic failure could ground the entire P-38 fleet and hand air superiority back to the Japanese. The solution involved implementing quality control procedures that were unprecedented in wartime manufacturing. Every component in Morrison's modification kits was individually inspected and tested before being approved for installation. The process was expensive and time-consuming, but it ensured that standardized kits would perform as reliably as Morrison's original hand-fitted modifications. Production ramped up slowly but steadily through the summer of 1943. The first mass-produced modification kits reached Pacific bases in August, accompanied by detailed installation manuals and training materials that Morrison had developed with Martinez's help. Mechanics who had never worked with Morrison personally could now perform installations that matched the quality of his original work. The Japanese response to the expanding fleet of modified P-38s was increasingly desperate. Intelligence services worked frantically to capture intact American aircraft so that engineers could study whatever modifications had transformed Lightning performance. Several ambitious operations were planned to raid Allied airfields and steal modified P-38s, but American security measures made such missions virtually impossible to execute. Japanese aircraft designers began working on emergency programs to develop new fighter designs that could match the enhanced American capabilities. But aircraft development timelines were measured in years, not months, and Japan's industrial capacity was already strained by existing production commitments. The modified P-38s were arriving in combat faster than Japanese engineers could respond to their. Some Japanese pilots began capabilities adopting increasingly risky tactics in attempts to counter the American aircraft advantages. Zero pilots started using kamikaze-style ramming attacks against P-38 formations, sacrificing their lives in desperate attempts to achieve kill ratios that conventional tactics could no longer deliver. The psychological toll on Japanese aviators was becoming as significant as the tactical losses they were suffering in combat. By September 1943, Morrison's modifications had been installed on over 800 P-38 aircraft across the Pacific Theater. The cumulative effect was transforming Allied air strategy in ways that military planners were still struggling to fully understand. Missions that had been considered impossible just months earlier were becoming routine operations, while Japanese defensive positions that had seemed impregnable were suddenly vulnerable to sustained air attack. The strategic bombing campaign against Japanese industrial targets received particular benefit from the P-38 improvements. Modified Lightnings could provide escort coverage for bomber formations across distances that had previously required multiple fighter relays. The extended range and improved combat effectiveness of P-38 escorts meant that American bombers could strike targets deep in Japanese-controlled territory with acceptable loss rates. Japanese anti-aircraft defenses, designed to counter aircraft with known performance limitations, found themselves ineffective against P-38s that could maneuver through defensive fire with unprecedented agility. Gun crews trained to lead targets based on predictable flight paths discovered that modified Lightnings could change direction so rapidly that conventional firing solutions became useless. Morrison himself had become something of a celebrity within Allied aviation circles, though he remained focused on continuous improvement rather than enjoying his newfound fame. Letters arrived daily from pilots describing how his modifications had saved their lives, but Morrison was more interested in the technical feedback that might lead to further improvements. His latest investigation centered on the P-38s' compressibility problems at high altitude. Lightning pilots had long struggled with control surface effectiveness during high-speed dives from extreme altitudes, where the aircraft would approach its critical Mach number and become difficult to control. Morrison suspected that some of the same binding issues he had solved at lower speeds might be contributing to high-altitude control problems. The high-altitude investigation required test flights that pushed both aircraft and pilots to their absolute limits. Captain Rodriguez, now Morrison's primary test pilot, found himself flying experimental P-38s to altitudes above 40,000 feet, where the thin air and extreme cold created conditions that no production aircraft had been designed to handle. The flights were dangerous beyond anything Rodriguez had experienced in combat, but the potential benefits made the risks worthwhile. Morrison's high-altitude modifications proved even more complex than his original control system improvements. The physics of flight at extreme altitudes created problems that couldn't be solved through simple mechanical fixes. Instead, Morrison had to develop entirely new control system concepts that automatically adjusted for changing atmospheric conditions as aircraft climbed or descended through different altitude bands. The breakthrough came when Morrison realized that the P-38's control system needed to behave differently at different altitudes, just as automobile transmissions automatically shifted gears to maintain optimal engine performance. By incorporating altitude sensing mechanisms into his control modifications, Morrison could create systems that provided appropriate control feel and response characteristics regardless of flight conditions. Testing the altitude-compensated modifications required coordination between multiple aircraft flying at different altitudes simultaneously. Rodriguez would climb his experimental P-38 to maximum altitude, while other pilots maintained positions at intermediate levels, creating a three-dimensional test matrix that allowed Morrison to validate his modifications across the entire flight envelope. The results exceeded even Morrison's optimistic expectations. P-38s equipped with altitude-compensated controls could maintain full maneuverability from sea level to service ceiling, giving American pilots tactical advantages that Japanese aircraft simply couldn't match. Zero fighters, designed for optimal performance at moderate altitudes, became sitting ducks when P-38s could attack from above with complete impunity. But Morrison's greatest achievement might have been the simplicity of his solutions. Despite their sophisticated performance characteristics, his modifications could still be installed and maintained by mechanics with standard training and equipment. The elegance of solving complex problems with simple solutions had become Morrison's signature, and it was exactly what Allied forces needed to maintain their aircraft in primitive field conditions. Japanese intelligence finally managed to capture detailed information about Morrison's modifications when a damaged P-38 was forced to land on a Japanese-controlled island in October 1943. The aircraft was too badly damaged to fly out, and the pilot was captured before he could completely destroy the sensitive equipment. Japanese engineers finally had their first close look at the modifications that had transformed American air power. The examination results were both illuminating and demoralizing for Japanese engineers. Morrison's modifications were mechanically simple, but conceptually brilliant, solving fundamental problems that Japanese designers had never fully recognized in their own aircraft. The realization that such elegant solutions had been developed by a field mechanic rather than a team of university-trained engineers was particularly damaging to Japanese confidence in their technical superiority. More troubling for Japan was the discovery that Morrison's modifications could theoretically be adapted to Japanese aircraft designs. The principles behind his improvements were universal, applicable to any aircraft that suffered from similar control system limitations. But implementing such modifications would require completely redesigning Japanese production processes and retraining thousands of mechanics, resources that Japan simply didn't possess in late 1943. The captured intelligence also revealed the scope of Morrison's modification program. Japanese analysts realized that hundreds of American aircraft had already been upgraded, with thousands more scheduled for modification in the coming months. The industrial capacity required to produce and install such modifications on that scale demonstrated American manufacturing advantages that Japan could never hope to match. The psychological impact on Japanese military leadership was devastating. Admiral Yamamoto, already concerned about Japan's ability to sustain its Pacific commitments, began privately advocating for negotiated peace before American advantages became completely overwhelming. Other officials pushed for desperate measures, including accelerated development of kamikaze tactics and experimental weapons that might offset conventional military disadvantages. But time was running out for Japanese hopes of maintaining air superiority. Every day brought more modified P-38s into combat, while Japanese aircraft remained fundamentally unchanged. The tactical balance that had sustained Japanese expansion was collapsing, and with it, the strategic foundation of Japan's entire war effort. Morrison, unaware of the broader strategic implications of his work, continued focusing on technical improvements that might provide additional advantages to Allied pilots. His latest project involved investigating ways to improve the P-38's already impressive firepower concentration, exploring modifications that might increase the accuracy and effectiveness of the aircraft's nose-mounted weapons. The firepower investigation led Morrison into areas of ballistics and aerodynamics that pushed his mechanical intuition into new territory. Unlike his previous modifications, which had addressed relatively straightforward mechanical problems, weapons accuracy involved complex interactions between aircraft motion, atmospheric conditions, and projectile ballistics that required mathematical analysis beyond Morrison's formal training. And there you have it, the incredible story of how one mechanic's simple wire trick completely transformed the Pacific Air War. Chuck Morrison's modifications didn't just fix a mechanical problem. They unleashed the true potential that had been locked inside the P-38 Lightning all along. From flying coffins to deadly predators, these aircraft went on to help secure Allied victory in the Pacific, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary breakthroughs come from the most unexpected places. If you enjoyed this deep dive into forgotten wartime innovation, smash that subscribe button. There are plenty more incredible stories waiting to be told.